Everyone knows the men of World War I. They were the fighters, the protectors, the heroes. But not many talk about the women.
And even less so, these women. In France, when the United States military was struggling to coordinate activities, these women resolutely entered a new frontier, in which they worked on the front lines of the most destructive war to date.
All while enduring the prejudices of their male counterparts and the public. They participated in some of the most significant events of the war, including the Meuse-Argonne Offensive and the Treaty of Versailles.
Yet even after they crossed frontiers in telecommunications and pioneered women's roles in the military, they weren't acknowledged as soldiers until 60 years after their service. These women were the Hello Girls of World War I.
The Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere.
When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, they sent General John Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force to aid the Allies in the war effort in France. But when they arrived, they encountered a major issue with communications in the Allied army. At the time, most countries used telegraphs, signal lamps, and radios to communicate, but they were very inefficient, as all of them utilized Morse code communication and lacked the important nuances of human-to-human interaction. The telephone, however, had a clear edge, as it was lightweight, not electricity-dependent, private, quick, and the only system at the time that could connect voices. It was a revolutionary invention that broke through a new frontier in communications. All a caller had to do was pick up the phone, tell the switchboard operator the number or name, and they could get in touch with anyone. The operator, on the other hand, had a more complex job. They got calls from a central exchange wire and had to patch them into the recipient's socket on the switchboard. Surprisingly, this was one of the few predominantly female occupations. People found that women were more polite and efficient than men when operating switchboards. The United States were famous for their advanced telephone technology too. However, in France, after years of constant warfare, the telephone lines were in rough shape. Many American soldiers had trouble communicating with the local French switchboard operators due to the language barrier. Yet the male English-speaking operators that were sent by the US Army were even worse, as they were impatient and didn't have the right temperament to deal with rude callers. So, General Pershing sent a telegram to America, requesting for young, bilingual women telephone operators to be sent to France. At first glance, this doesn't seem like an unusual request of the Army, especially because the Navy and Marines had already begun recruiting women into their ranks to fill clerical jobs. Even before World War I, women had always played minor roles in war, often finding work as Army nurses and cooks, or aiding soldiers from the sidelines by making supplies like uniforms and blankets. Despite this history, the request for female operators was met with backlash, as the Army hated the idea of women who were supposed to be housewives, cooks, and mothers operating so close to the front lines as actual soldiers, thought that their enlistment would cause other nations to mock the US for being too feminine. In fact, while many Americans shared this misogynistic sentiment, when the advertisements for female Signal Corps recruits appeared in newspapers, women swiftly applied, eager to show their patriotism and become real soldiers of the Army.
Despite the many stringent requirements, including that women had to be between the ages of 25 and 35, they couldn't have husbands in the war already, they had to speak both French and English perfectly, and they had to be in good physical health, more than 7,600 women applied. The recruitment process was meticulous. Applicants were selected and approved based on telephone experience, French and English fluency, heritage, and even character. Most operators remember the test as being an arduous experience. In fact, many of the assessments and qualifications were the same as those of male Army officers at the time.
These women were expected to be not only the best of the best due to their significance to the Army, but also trustworthy enough to handle battlefield secrets on the front lines. Eventually, in January of 1918, the selection process was finished, and the women needed to be trained. So, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, partnered with the Signal Corps, the Army's communications support branch, to coach the women. These women went through intensive training, and by March, the US Army had about 450 women who were sworn in, inducting them into the US Signal Corps. They were ready to be shipped abroad at a moment's notice. Over the remainder of the war, 223 women would be sent to France in 6 different regiments. There, they would work at headquarters in Chaumont or at an alternative location. Arriving in France, these women were plunged into the midst of a war and the unfamiliar frontier of the front lines. Although they had prepared vigorously, nothing could truly prepare them for what lay ahead.
Life on the front was far from uneventful for the women, as they endured the same air raids and other dangers as the men. Despite them facing similar horrors, the women were initially not taken seriously by most of the troops already there. Even though they wore uniforms, had the same rank as a cadet, and were subject to Army regulations and frequent interrogations, they were obviously not respected. But the women refused to let this hinder their performance. They never once doubted that they were proper soldiers, and after just a few weeks, many of the male soldiers had to agree. They were impressed with the skill and discipline the women showed as they worked complex switchboards under pressure and were consistently exemplary soldiers.
Furthermore, these women proved to be exactly what the U.S. Army needed, as communications on the battlefield improved significantly after their arrival.
The average doughboy 60 seconds to connect a phone call, and it took the average hello girl 10 seconds.
Not only that, but the U.S. soldiers felt more at ease with the English-speaking operators than with the French ones.
These women became essential. They were soon integrated into the regular Army routine. So, when General Pershing decided to move one of the AEF's field armies, the First Army, to Ligny and Pourquoi to lead the first American-led attack, some Hello Girls were bound to come along.
General Pershing's plan was to attack the Saint-Mihiel salient on the banks of the Meuse River on September 12, 1918. Since only 6 female operators were brought to the Saint-Mihiel offensive, they worked constantly, through injury and sleep deprivation. After the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, the First Army quickly moved to Souilly to prepare for the upcoming Meuse-Argonne offensive. Although being part of an offensive was a new frontier for these Hello Girls, they were instrumental in both battles, communicating artillery firing orders and troop movement.
Luckily, 7 more Hello Girls joined the women in Souilly. Surprisingly, French-American communications suffered no decline during this time despite the switchboards being incredibly understaffed. Calls were still being diligently handled even through the danger the women were in. In their own way, these women helped secure the victories of these battles.
Finally, after 4 years of war, on November 11, 1918, the armistice went into effect, putting an end to the fighting. The Hello Girls had finally finished their duty on the front lines, but their time in service wasn't over yet. Some Hello Girls were instead transferred to Paris, where they would connect calls for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Even after the treaty, many of the women still stayed in France because the US needed communications to get all of their troops back. The last of the Hello Girls left in 1920. They came back as victorious soldiers who proudly served their country, even if it was through unconventional methods.
But the Hello Girls' greatest battle had yet to come. Little did the women know the US Army arbitrarily refused to acknowledge the women as soldiers. They were supposedly employed in the Army, not enlisted. So when the women applied for veteran benefits and honorable discharges, they were denied. According to the Army and War Department, they had been civilian contractors, not soldiers. Even though none of the women signed any contracts and they all had written proof of oaths they took to enlist, they were still rejected. The Hello Girls and their supporters fought for their rights for almost 60 years, petitioning senator after senator, introducing bill after bill, but to no avail. One Hello Girl, Merle Egan Anderson, made it her mission to change the War Department's mind. She enlisted the help of a lawyer, Mark Ho, and together they sued. Their evidence convinced judges, and the Hello Girls were acknowledged with the GI Bill Improvement Act of 1977. While other female soldiers like the Women Air Force service pilots received their recognition, the Hello Girls struggled to earn the same respect. The WASPs of World War II were the first female pilots in our Army, and similarly, they didn't gain their recognition until after a 30-year-long fight. For the Hello Girls, it took 60 years, 24 failed bills, and countless ignored petitions before they finally got their recognition as soldiers of World War I. 2 years later, the remaining Hello Girls received honorable discharges. But 60 years later was 60 years too late. There were only 33 surviving Hello Girls in 1979. Society had finally progressed to the point where the Army could admit they made a mistake in not recognizing the validity of the Hello Girls' claim and their contribution to the war effort. Had it been a different time, the Hello Girls would have cemented their place in history as pioneers who crossed frontiers in communication and women's roles in both the military and society.
These women took advantage of the unique opportunity grudgingly presented to them, proving to at least some that women had value beyond what society dictated for them.
The women who were in the Army crossed the ocean, which was one of the most dangerous things you could do in World War I with all the German submarines. And also, some of them served right close to the action. I mean, as close as the generals themselves ever got. And so the Army, which had exposed women to so much greater harm, and who did die, refused to acknowledge them. And I think all we can say is that prejudice against women was very old and very deep, and we should all be very, very grateful that times have changed as much as they have, and treasure that progress.
Come back! till it's over there.